August 1944. A dusty, sun-scorched training range in the rear area depots near Cherbourg, France. The air hums with the distant promise of frontline combat, but here the routine is dangerously hollow. A company of black replacement infantry stands in orderly rows, their rifles held with precision, yet their magazines remain empty. Across the field, white replacement companies fire live rounds into the embankment, the sharp crack of controlled bursts echoing rhythmically. When the black soldiers request their turn at the firing line, they are met with a dismissive gesture toward a pile of dry wooden sticks. They are denied the tools of their survival. 2 weeks later, they are marched toward the front lines, their proficiency untested and their weapons unzeroed. Their first engagement will soon turn into a slaughter, and one man's prejudice will prove to be their final death sentence. This is the story of how one man's prejudice became another man's death sentence. The events in this rear area depot near Cherbourg exposed a lethal failure in the chain of command that demanded immediate correction. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show when one man's prejudice became another man's death sentence. Second Lieutenant James Avery was 23 years old, hailing from the busy streets of Philadelphia. He had enlisted following the loss of his younger brother at Anzio, driven by a quiet, iron resolve to lead men who were often dismissed by the very army they served. Avery commanded a replacement infantry company that had been forged in the crucible of segregated training camps. He had seen the way his men were overlooked, forced to endure endless drills with outdated equipment, while their counterparts were issued the latest gear. He had requested live-fire training 4 separate times, documenting every rejection in his ledger, determined to ensure his soldiers were ready for the grim realities of the front line. He stood on the edge of the range, his eyes fixed on the men he was responsible for, knowing that sending them into combat without this training was a failure he could not accept. Praster Sergeant Vernon Goss was 44 years old, a career range operations, non-commissioned officer from San Diego, who held a tight, uncompromising grip on the facility schedule. Goss believed that live fire range time was a finite resource to be managed with surgical selectivity, arguing openly that allocating precious ammunition to black units was a waste of the war effort. His uniform was always perfectly pressed. His boots gleamed with a mirror shine that reflected his obsession with order, and his office in the depot was a sanctuary of clean, polished mahogany and organized files. He maintained a meticulous logbook, entering every training session with a fountain pen, carefully marking the black replacement units as completed for dry-fire drills, while systematically denying them access to a single live round for 6 months. He saw his role as a guardian of efficiency, convinced that his decisions were justified by the rigid hierarchies of his time. By August 1944, the Allied advance across France was moving with a desperate, crushing velocity. The liberation of Cherbourg had turned the peninsula into a massive, frantic logistical bottleneck. Thousands of replacement soldiers arrived daily, processed through rear area depots like shifting tides, and then pushed immediately toward the hedgerows of Normandy. Supply chains were stretched to their absolute limit. Fuel, ammunition, and food were always in short supply, creating a culture of hoarding and rationing that trickled down to the lowest levels of command. This environment of chaos and scarcity provided the perfect cover for officers and NCOs to impose their own private hierarchies. Because the front demanded men constantly, training protocols were frequently ignored or bypassed to fill decimated infantry ranks. Some commanders were overwhelmed by the pressure, while others used the administrative confusion to hide their own personal biases. In this specific sector, the systemic neglect of black units was treated as a local administrative efficiency. It was a common sight to see white units cycling through the firing ranges, consuming thousands of rounds to sharpen their marksmanship, while just a few hundred yards away, black companies were relegated to the sidelines. The military bureaucracy rarely looked closely at these training logs as long as the quotas for replacement bodies were met. Officers who might have intervened were too concerned with their own sectors, or were simply complicit in the belief that certain soldiers were inherently less deserving of the resources required for modern combat. The discrepancy in live-fire training was not a secret, but a quiet, accepted reality of the depot's daily operation. Nobody asked questions about why the logbooks for these specific companies remained empty. Nobody raised concerns about the men departing for the front with zero experience in managing the mechanical failure of a rifle. It was a failure of the entire oversight chain, a collective look the other way that turned training into a hollow performance. The sun beat down on the empty range, and the silence from the firing line signaled that the status quo remained undisturbed. Lieutenant Avery approached the range office, his cap tucked under his arm. He knocked twice on the heavy wooden frame. Master Sergeant Goss did not look up from his ledger. He continued to write with precise, rhythmic strokes. Avery spoke first. "Sergeant, my men are scheduled for the afternoon slot. We are here for the live-fire qualification." Goss turned a page. "The schedule is full. Lieutenant, dry fire only for your company." Avery stepped forward. "That is the 4th time this week. My company is deploying to the front in 2 weeks. They need to fire live rounds." Goss leaned back in his chair. He tapped the desk with his fountain pen. "Look at the ledger, Lieutenant. Ammunition is a finite resource. Conservation is the policy. The policy is qualification. Sergeant, my men cannot qualify with broomsticks. They need to know how to clear a jam under pressure." Goss chuckled. "They will learn soon enough. The front is a very effective teacher." Avery stiffened. "My men have orders to be combat ready. These orders come from the top. You are obstructing mission readiness." Goss stood up slowly. He smoothed his uniform. He stared at Avery. "Do you think I care about your little training problems? I manage the flow of this depot. I decide who uses the range. And I have decided that your men do not need live ammunition to practice the basics." Avery pulled a notebook from his pocket. "I have documentation of every denial. I will take this to the battalion commander if you do not open the range." Goss walked around the desk. He stopped inches from Avery. "You think you can go over my head? I have been here 6 months. Every black unit that rolls through here gets the same treatment. They mark their logs as completed. They go to the front. The war continues. Nothing changes." Avery did not blink. "It changes today." Goss spat on the floor near Avery's boot. "It changes when I say it changes. Get your men back to their billets. If I see you at my range again, I will have you on a detail cleaning latrines until you deploy. Now get out." Avery backed away. He turned and walked toward the staging area. He stopped at the radio hut. He grabbed the handset. He spoke his request. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton's command jeep skidded to a halt in the loose gravel of the range, the engine cutting out with a sharp, metallic pop. He stepped out, his tall frame cutting a distinct silhouette against the harsh light. The 4 stars on his helmet caught the sun, and the ivory handles of his revolvers were gripped firmly against his hips. The atmosphere on the range shifted instantly. The air grew dense and heavy as officers and men alike stopped their work to watch him. He walked forward, his stride measured and deliberate, his face a cold mask of controlled intensity. He did not raise his voice, but the sudden silence in the compound made his presence feel absolute. Patton stopped directly in front of Master Sergeant Goss. He studied the man for a long moment, letting the silence stretch until Goss began to fidget. Then Patton spoke. "How many live rounds did these men fire before they were sent to face the German army?" Goss hesitated, his throat working. "Zell, General," Patton stared into his eyes. "And how many of them died in their first engagement?" "3, sir." Patton tilted his head slightly. "Could a man who has never cleared a live jam in training survive a jam when a machine gun is pointed at his face?" Goss looked down at his polished boots. "No, sir." Patton stood motionless, his shadow stretching long across the dirt. "You sat here in this office. You made a choice to conserve ammunition by denying training to men who needed it to survive. You took a deliberate, calculated risk with the lives of soldiers who were sent here to qualify. You filed reports stating they were ready. You put your signature on their death warrants. You took the responsibility of a leader and you reduced it to a clerk's petty spite. That is not conservation." That is a death sentence with a rubber stamp. You decided that your convenience was worth more than their lives. You are a disgrace to the uniform you wear. Patton turned his back on the sergeant and looked out toward the empty firing line. You have a choice. You can pack your gear and walk out of this camp, or you can stay here and do the work you refuse to do for these men. You will personally oversee the qualification of the next replacement company. You will stand on that line with them for every drill. You will hand them the rounds yourself. You will ensure that every single man learns to clear every single jam, every round, every drill, every day, under the observation of 3rd Army officers until I am satisfied. Decide now. Goss stood paralyzed, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He finally nodded, a silent, hollow acceptance of his fate. Patton did not wait for a verbal answer. He simply gestured to the observers and walked back to his jeep. The following morning, the range was transformed into a site of grueling, unrelenting repetition. Under the watchful eyes of 3rd Army observers, Master Sergeant Goss stood at the edge of the firing line, his posture rigid and his expression hollow. He was forced to oversee the full qualification of the next black replacement company, ensuring every soldier fired every round required by regulation. The sharp, rhythmic crack of M1 Garand's filled the air, a stark contrast to the silence of the previous weeks. Goss had to personally demonstrate the clearing of complex jams, his hands trembling slightly as he handled the weapons he had once claimed were too precious for these men to use. He worked until his uniform was soaked with sweat and dust, his gaze forced to meet the eyes of the soldiers he had previously dismissed. The other NCOs and officers on the depot watched in silence, their expressions guarded as they witnessed the Master Sergeant's public penance. The scent of burnt cordite and hot steel hung heavy in the heat, a sensory reminder of the training that had been denied to the men who died weeks earlier. By the time the final platoon cleared their weapons, the lesson was etched into the records of every man present. After the war, Lieutenant James Avery returned to Philadelphia, where he finished his law degree and spent decades representing veterans who had been denied the benefits they earned in combat. He died in 1994, leaving behind a legacy of quiet strength and a firm refusal to let the sacrifices of his men be forgotten by those in power. Master Sergeant Vernon Goss was relieved of duty and faced a summary court-martial. He was sentenced to 2 years of hard labor before receiving a dishonorable discharge in 1946. He returned to a small town in Southern California, living a quiet, bitter life as a night watchman until his death in 1972. Never once speaking of the afternoon, the general arrived at his range. Patton never spoke of the incident in his memoirs or public speeches, treating the correction as a routine matter of military discipline that required no explanation. However, he kept a copy of the final, verified qualification report in his personal desk drawer for the remainder of the war. He once wrote to a staff officer that a commander who allows his men to enter battle untrained is not just negligent, he is a traitor to the very oath he swore to uphold. Some historians have argued that Patton's focus on rigid discipline and public retribution occasionally overshadowed the systemic institutional failures that enabled such abuses in the first place. Others have argued the opposite, suggesting that in the chaotic environment of wartime France, decisive, personalized intervention was the only mechanism capable of enforcing standards across an overburdened army. What is certain is that the policy change enforced at the depot established a mandatory standard for combat qualification that was applied to every replacement unit within the 3rd Army, regardless of designation, for the remainder of the war. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same, or would you have simply ignored the paperwork? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about the moments that forced people to face what they'd done, make sure to subscribe.